They say dignity isn't something you wear on your chest. It's something that survives in silence, long after the battles are over. Some men never raise their voices, never ask for recognition, yet their presence alone carries more weight than any medal. This is not a tale of war, but of quiet strength, of a forgotten veteran's respect tested in the middle of an ordinary fair when the world looked away, until silence spoke louder than noise. Stay with me, because what happens next will remind you why true honor never fades. If this story touches you, don't forget to follow, like, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more untold stories like this to life. The air at the Maple Ridge Fair carried a sweetness of fried dough and spun sugar, the kind of smell that promised joy to children and nostalgia to their parents. Music from a carousel bled into the echo of carnival barkers shouting prizes no one really wanted. The crowd pulsed with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of soda cups. It was the sort of afternoon where time felt harmless, where troubles seemed far away. But at the heart of the crowd, something happened that most tried to pretend they hadn't seen. An old man stumbled backward, his balance lost after a shove from a broad-shouldered biker. He caught himself against the dusty ground, steadying with the help of his cane. He didn't curse, he didn't shout. He simply dusted off his faded brown coat, brushing away bits of gravel with a kind of patience that suggested he'd weathered far worse. The biker laughed, flashing mirrored sunglasses that reflected the sun back into the faces of onlookers. "Watch where you're going, Grandpa," he barked, a cruel grin tugging at his mouth. For a brief moment, the crowd's gaze landed on the old man, but just as quickly, eyes slid away. People turned their backs, swallowed by the safety of pretending nothing had happened. The fair moved on. The old man made his way to a bench, if you could call it that. A splintered plank of wood leaned unevenly beside a lemonade stand. He lowered himself slowly, each movement measured, a slight wince crossing his face as his knees gave protest. Still he made no sound. His coat shifted with the motion, revealing the faint outline of a patch near the shoulder. Time had dulled its color, but if someone had cared to look closely, they might have seen an eagle mid-flight, its wings spread as though refusing to fall. Children noticed. They always noticed. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, that man fell. Shouldn't we help him?" His mother pressed her lips tight, pulled him away by the wrist, and whispered something sharp he couldn't quite hear. Another little girl pointed, eyed, but her father hurried her toward the candy booth. The old man saw it all but didn't flinch. His hands rested on the knob of his cane, wood polish smooth from years of use. A couple wandered past, the woman's brow knitting as she caught sight of the bruise forming at his side. "You'd think someone would do something," she murmured. "Probably just some old drunk," her partner replied, not slowing his step. The music swelled again, balloons bobbing above the heads of children, the Ferris wheel spinning against a late afternoon sky. Around the old man, though, there was a pocket of quiet, as though people couldn't quite bear to share the air too close to him. He didn't ask them to. His gaze drifted across the fairground toward the Ferris wheel. His breathing was steady, his face lined with the kind of silence that comes from caring too much for too long. Beneath the ache in his knees and the sting of the fall, something steadier pulsed, the kind of endurance that doesn't fade with age. On the far side of the fair, the biker leaned against his Harley, sunglasses catching the sun. He flexed his jaw, exhaling smoke, bragging to his friends as if he'd just walked away from a fight he'd won. "Guy nearly scuffed my boots," he said with a laugh, slapping one of them on the back. His companions chuckled, half distracted by a group of teenagers filming the old man from across the lot. One teen zoomed in on his camera. "Bro, this is gonna blow up on TikTok. Gramps took a nap at the fair." He snickered, fingers tapping captions onto his screen. A young couple paused nearby. The girl's voice trembled. "That didn't look like an accident." The boy shook his head, unease in his eyes. "I'm not getting involved, babe. Let's just leave it." Behind a row of fried food stalls, a security guard noticed the scene. He took one step forward, then stopped. His eyes narrowed, but his shoulders sagged. The thought of paperwork, of explaining anything to anyone, was too much for him. He turned his back and melted into the crowd. The biker blew another stream of smoke into the air, grinning as though the world existed only to entertain him. His words carried just enough to reach the ears of anyone close by. Shouldn't be in the way if you can't stand your ground, he mocked. Some people laughed awkwardly, more out of habit than humor. Others shifted their weight, unsure but unwilling to say a word. The old man didn't move. His fingers remained still on the cane. He didn't glare, didn't respond, didn't even meet the biker's eyes. He just sat, looking out past the horizon as though waiting for something the rest of them couldn't see. And though the fair buzzed with sound, the squeals of children on rides, the calls of vendors selling fried treats, the squeak of balloons against each other, there was an undercurrent forming. Around the old man, silence deepened. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of weight, of history, of something unspoken that demanded respect even when no one was brave enough to give it. It lingered in the air, unacknowledged, heavy as stone. No one realized that this silence was not weakness. It was the steady pulse of a man who had lived through storms, through fire, through nights darker than any fairground could ever hold. A man who needed no applause, no defense, and no pity. But silence never lasts forever. Something was about to shift, though none of them knew it yet. The bikers' laughter carried too loud, the crowd's indifference stretched too thin, and beneath the hum of carnival noise, a story long buried was waiting to be told. And as the old man sat with his hands folded on his cane, the weight of his quiet presence was beginning to call out louder than any shove, any laugh, or any cruel word could ever manage. The biker leaned back against his motorcycle, his leather vest creasing across his chest as he flicked ash from his cigarette. His sunglasses mirrored the crowd, faces turning quickly away, pretending interest in raffle tickets or the spinning wheel of prizes. His voice rose again, thick with mockery. "Shouldn't be in the way if you can't stand your ground," he called, a smirk tugging at his mouth. The words floated just far enough to sting. Some in the crowd gave a short, nervous laugh. Others shifted awkwardly, pretending they hadn't heard. The fair carried on as though it hadn't happened, yet the air had changed. Beneath the laughter of children and the crackling of grease in food stalls, a faint discomfort threaded through the space like a warning that hadn't yet found its voice. Not everyone dismissed what they saw. Near the corn dog stand, a man stood still. He was older than most in the crowd, his beard thick and streaked with gray, his skin weathered like leather from years of sun and wind. Over denim, he wore a vest stitched with patches that spoke of another life. Operation Desert Storm, Rolling Thunder 007, and stitched boldly across the back in black and gold. Veterans Brotherhood, MC, Southern Division. His name was Mac. He hadn't said a word all afternoon. He didn't laugh when others did. He didn't shake his head and walk away like so many. Instead, he simply watched. His eyes, narrowed beneath the brim of his cap, shifted between the old man on the bench and the biker who leaned smugly against his Harley. Mac had seen this before. He had seen indifference carve silence into good men, had watched crowds turn their backs when dignity was being stripped in plain daylight. His jaw tightened. Then, without a word, he stepped behind the food stall, away from the direct line of sight, and pulled something from his pocket. It was an old flip phone, burnished and scratched from years of use. He snapped it open, the hinge clicking softly, and pressed a single button. The line connected. "Yeah, came the voice on the other end. "It's Mac," he said, low and steady. "It's happening again." Silence stretched for half a breath. "Location?" "Maple Ridge Fairground, center stage." "How bad?" Mac's gaze flickered toward the bench. The old man still sat motionless, his cane resting in his hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the Ferris wheel. He looked untouched by the commotion, untouched by the humiliation, untouched even by the laughter. A bruise had begun to darken beneath his coat, but he didn't shift, didn't seek pity, didn't flinch. Then Mac's eyes slid to the biker. The cigarette burned bright between his fingers, his grin wide as he puffed smoke into the air, carrying himself like a king no one had crowned. "Worse than it looks," Mac murmured into the phone. The voice on the other end didn't ask more. "On our way." Mac closed the phone with a sharp snap and slid it back into his vest. He returned to the edge of the lemonade booth, leaning against it casually, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the old man. Around him, the fair rattled on, oblivious. The tilt-a-whirl spun teenagers into shrieks. Cotton candy spun into bright pink clouds. Announcers shouted raffle numbers through crackling speakers. And then, beneath it all, something new stirred. At first, it was so faint that no one noticed. A vibration, low and steady, thrummed through the gravel paths, rattling soda cups against tabletops. It wasn't thunder, though it rolled like a storm. It was a sound deeper than weather, a sound that came from machines built not for play, but for presence. The biker heard it first. His head tilted, his grin faltering just slightly. He pulled the cigarette from his mouth, squinting past the vendor tents. "What the hell?" he muttered, too low for his friends to hear. One headlight appeared on the ridge beyond the fairground, then another, then three more. Within seconds, the hill glowed with twin beams, the air thickening with the synchronized thrum of engines. The sound grew heavier, rolling closer, swallowing the chatter of the fairground as though silencing it by sheer will. Conversations broke off. Heads turned. Parents lifted children to see. The crowd leaned instinctively toward the noise, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore. And then they came into view. 20 motorcycles, matte black and polished, rolling in a perfect line down the gravel path that cut through the fair's main lane. Engines deep, steady, unshowy. They didn't rev for spectacle, didn't swerve for attention. They simply arrived, the rhythm of their approach like a drumbeat meant for only one thing: presence. Each rider wore the same patch Mac carried on his back: Veterans Brotherhood MC. Below it, stitched in solemn thread, were 4 words: "You never stand alone." The lead bike bore a larger patch, the letters clearer, the message louder though no voice had spoken. He guided the group with unflinching precision, parking first. One by one, the others followed, forming a silent wall of chrome and steel, a barricade of quiet power. The biker straightened where he stood, sunglasses hiding his eyes but not the tension in his jaw. His laugh was gone. He forced words through lips that suddenly felt dry. "What is this? Some retirement ride?" He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked in his throat, thin and nervous. The front rider removed his helmet. Silver hair spilled against his shoulders, a scar dragging down the line of his jaw. His eyes scanned the fair without haste, without intimidation. He didn't look at the biker. He didn't look at the crowd. His focus fixed on the old man sitting quietly on the bench, cane steady against the gravel. He stepped forward, unfastening his gloves. The silence spread across the fairground like water across stone. Vendors paused mid-sale. Children stilled mid-laugh. Even the Ferris wheel seemed to slow, as though sensing the weight of something sacred entering the space. The man stopped in front of the bench. For the first time, the old man looked up. His eyes narrowed just slightly, recognition flickering in their depths. He didn't rise. Not yet. The lead rider's voice, low and rough, carried just enough for the front rows to hear. "Been a long time, Gunny." The old man exhaled, the smallest nod bending his head. And in that breath, the fairground was no longer a place of balloons and fried food. It had become something else, a stage where silence itself was about to speak louder than all the laughter, all the music, all the cruelty that had come before. If this story has moved you so far, take a moment to follow, like, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Every gesture of support helps keep these untold stories alive for more people to hear. The biker shifted uneasily, his cigarette hanging limp between his fingers. For the first time all afternoon, his smirk faltered. The wall of motorcycles stood silent, gleaming under the late sun, their riders motionless, their presence heavier than any words could be. No one spoke. No one laughed. The carnival music felt distant now, like an echo in another world. The lead rider, silver hair brushing against the scar across his jaw, stood tall in front of the bench. He looked down at the old man with something between respect and sorrow. The old man's shoulders, once hunched, lifted almost imperceptibly, his back straightening as though the weight of invisibility had slipped away. The scarred rider removed his gloves slowly, deliberate, and said again in a voice low but steady, "Been a long time, Gunny." The old man's lips curled into the faintest line of acknowledgement. His voice, when it came, was quiet but strong. "Some days I wonder too." A ripple passed through the crowd. The name spread in whispers. Gunny. A few heads turned, confusion etched across their faces. "Who's Gunny?" a woman asked aloud. "That guy? The one who fell earlier?" A teenage boy leaned closer to his father. "Is he someone important?" The father didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if searching memory for a name buried long ago. At the edge of the group, Max stepped forward. He pulled off his vest, revealing a faded t-shirt beneath. Across its chest were numbers and letters cracked with age. 3rd Battalion, Fire Base Ajax, 1972. His voice carried across the fairground, firm and unshaken. "You ever heard," Mac began, his eyes locking on the crowd, "of the man who pulled 9 wounded from a burning convoy under mortar fire, then walked 20 kilometers for evac on a busted leg?" Silence fell heavier than before. Not a sound stirred but the faint rustle of the breeze. Mac's words cut through it. He didn't get a medal, didn't want one, just asked to go home. The old man remained still, cane at his side, his eyes lowered, but his presence unshaken. Around him, the 20 riders stood in formation, their faces shadowed by time, their silence more powerful than any show of force. The biker, the same man who had shoved him, stood frozen. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but not the color draining from his face. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. One of the younger riders walked past him, casually brushing against his shoulder, knocking the cigarette from his hand without a glance. It fell into the gravel, smoke curling up until it died against the wind. Still, no one touched him, no threats, no violence, just presence. The old man finally shifted. He pressed the cane into the gravel, pushing himself to his feet with slow intention. His spine straightened, each movement deliberate. When he stood fully, the crowd stepped back instinctively, not from fear, but from a respect that had bloomed suddenly, unspoken and undeniable. "I didn't come here for trouble," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Just wanted to hear the music. Eat a funnel cake." The scarred rider smiled faintly, a crease cutting across his jaw. "Then let's get you one, on us." The crowd parted like water. People moved aside without needing to be told. Children stared wide-eyed, phones lowered, voices hushed. Somewhere in the silence, a little boy stepped forward, the same boy who had tugged at his mother's sleeve earlier. His small hand brushed the old man's coat gently. "Mister," he asked, his voice trembling, "are you really a hero?" The old man's eyes softened, looking down at the boy. "No, son," he said, "I just rode with a few." Gasps rippled through the gathering. The weight of history hung in the air, unseen but felt. Faces in the crowd shifted from curiosity to awe, from dismissal to shame. They saw him differently now, not as the frail man who had fallen, but as a ghost of battles they had never known. Mac's voice rose again, heavy with memory. "Firebase Ajax, 1972. Convoy hit halfway to resupply. Ambush so brutal most never saw it coming. Trucks burning, smoke so thick you couldn't see your boots. He pulled 9 men out of that fire. 9. And carried them through the jungle with a broken knee, barefoot by the end. You ever wonder how some of us came home? Him. That's how." The crowd was utterly still. A whisper broke it. "My uncle, Lieutenant Briggs, he used to tell me about a ghost that carried him out. Said he never got to thank him." All eyes turned back to the old man, to Gunny, as though searching for proof in his weathered face. He didn't argue, didn't confirm, didn't deny. Even the biker, who had laughed so loudly minutes before, seemed smaller now, his bravado stripped by silence. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He wasn't born when the ambush happened. He hadn't known who he mocked. But now he understood enough to feel the weight of it. One of the veterans, younger than most, turned his head and fixed the biker with a stare sharp as steel. His words were measured, unflinching. "You shoved a man who never shoved anyone, not even the ones trying to kill him." The biker's lips parted. Nothing came out. His throat worked, but no sound followed. The words he had lived on, mockery, jokes, bravado, had abandoned him. And so he stood, small against the wall of men who carried scars deeper than his pride could ever match. The fairground was silent now, a silence thicker than any song, any laughter. A silence that carried history, a silence that recognized the weight of one man's life, lived without demand for recognition, lived with dignity that no shove could take away. The fairground air felt different now. Where laughter and music had dominated moments before, a hush had fallen, heavy and reverent. Even the Ferris wheel slowed, its creak echoing faintly as though unwilling to disturb the moment. All eyes were on the old man who had risen from the splintered bench, cane in hand but standing tall, his presence commanding without a single demand. A boy, the same one who had tugged on his mother's arm earlier, stood in front of him, looking up with wide eyes. "Mister, are you really a hero?" he asked, his small voice carrying further than he intended. The old man bent slightly, his gaze softening. "No, son," he said gently. "I just rode with a few." Those words, simple as they were, struck harder than any boast or speech could have. Around them, silence deepened, broken only by the faint rustle of flags over the vendor stalls and the shifting of gravel under heavy boots. The memory of 1972 seemed to hang in the air, of the jungle, of fire and smoke, of the convoy torn apart under relentless attack. The story Mac had spoken was no tale spun from rumor. It was truth carried in scars and silence. Gunny, the old man they had watched fall, had borne burdens too heavy for medals, too sacred for applause. The crowd saw it now. The parents who had pulled their children away lowered their eyes. The couple who had dismissed him as a drunk pressed closer together, faces pale. Teenagers who had been eager to film for entertainment now kept their phones lowered, ashamed of the captions they had nearly posted. At the edge of the path, the biker stood stiff, his face drained of its swagger. He shifted his weight, glanced at his Harley, then back at the man he had mocked. His mouth opened, words fumbling to escape, but no sound came. An apology lingered, unfinished, unwanted in the presence of such truth. The veterans didn't need to touch him. Their silence had already spoken. The fair organizer, a woman in her 40s clutching a clipboard, finally stepped forward. Her eyes darted nervously between the veterans and the crowd. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling, but sincere. "Sir," she said, addressing Gunny with a bow of her head, "we would be honored if you took the main seat for today's ceremony." The old man blinked, his grip tightening on his cane. "I didn't come here for a ceremony," he answered quietly. "I know," she replied softly. "But people should know who you are, even if you never ask them." Her words seemed to unlock something in the crowd. Murmurs of agreement rippled, heads nodding, shoulders straightening as if in silent admission that they had failed to see what was right before them. The biker tried again to speak, but the sound died in his throat as the veterans turned their eyes on him, not with anger, but with the kind of cold truth that stripped a man bare. The group shifted slightly, creating a path. Gunny began to walk, cane steady against the gravel, his steps measured but firm. The crowd moved back without being told, parting like a tide before him. Children stepped aside, their hands clutching popcorn bags forgotten. Teenagers lowered their phones completely, eyes wide with unspoken respect. Even the carnival worker who had ignored his fall earlier now looked down at the ground, shame etched into his face. At the front of the fair, a sturdier chair had been placed, its arms padded, a small plaque affixed to the back. The words read, "Reserved for one who stood when others couldn't." Gunny lowered himself into the seat slowly, cane across his lap. He did not smile, did not gesture, did not bask in attention. His eyes scanned the faces before him, not with pride, not with judgment, but with memory. Behind him, the line of motorcycles remained, their engines off, their riders unmoving, a wall of quiet strength. Max stepped close, leaning down so only Gunny could hear. His words were rough with emotion, his voice nearly breaking. "You never had to call us, brother. We always knew where you were." The old man closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly, the weight of years carried in that single breath. The fair resumed, cautiously at first. The Ferris wheel creaked back to life, music sputtered from the speakers again. Children's voices rose, though softer now, respectful of the presence still settled over the grounds. Yet nothing was the same. Every person who had witnessed the moment carried it now. The image of a man who had stood silently while mocked, who had revealed himself not with boast but with dignity, who had been lifted not by his own demand, but by the brothers who had never forgotten him. The biker stood apart, his hands restless at his sides. He no longer looked tall. He no longer looked powerful. In the shadow of men who had fought and bled and carried one another through the fire, he looked small. Gunner James Holt, known to his brothers as Gunny, sat quietly. His story had not been told for glory, nor for applause. It had been told because silence had finally met its answer in the rumble of engines and the weight of memory. Some men ask for recognition, others carry their service quietly until the world reminds them they were never forgotten. As the fair settled into evening, the motorcycles remained, lined like guardians behind him, their chrome catching the sunset. And though not a word was spoken, the message was clear. Respect is not demanded. It is earned, it is carried, and it is remembered. If you have ever watched someone stand tall after being pushed down, or believe that dignity still matters more than noise, then this story was for you. Follow, like, and comment below if you believe in honoring the quiet strength of those who carried burdens for us all. Because sometimes the loudest statement comes from those who say nothing at all.